When the Dutch merchant ship Batavia sank in 1629, one survivor staged a mutiny on the Coral Island, crowned himself king, and systematically murdered 125 of the other survivors while waiting for rescue. The wreck of the Batavia is one of the most thoroughly documented catastrophes in maritime history. The VOC, the Dutch East India Company, kept meticulous records, and the surviving survivors testified at length. What happened on that reef in the Indian Ocean between June and September 1629 was methodical, calculated, and horrifying. It was also, in its own way, a story about what happens when authority collapses and one very specific kind of person fills the vacuum. The Batavia was the flagship of the Dutch East India Company, launched in 1628 on its maiden voyage to Batavia, the colonial capital in what is now Indonesia. She carried 322 people, sailors, soldiers, VOC merchants and their families, servants, and passengers. She also carried one of the most valuable cargoes in Dutch colonial history, chests of silver, trade goods, and a collection of 12 decorative sandstone relief panels intended for the Governor-General's castle in Batavia. On the morning of June 4, 1629, the Batavia ran aground on a coral reef in the Houtman-Abrolhos Islands, off the coast of what is now Western Australia. The impact destroyed the ship's hull. Most of the cargo and most of the people made it to the surrounding low coral islands. The commander, Francisco Pelsaert, made a decision that would determine everything that followed. He took the ship's longboat, loaded it with the most important people and the most critical supplies, and set sail for Batavia, 2,000 kilometers to the north, to get help. He left approximately 250 survivors on the islands with limited food and water under the nominal command of a junior merchant named Cornelisz. Cornelisz was not a typical survivor. Before the voyage, he had been involved in a heretical religious movement in the Netherlands and had fled prosecution by signing on with the VOC. He held unconventional beliefs about morality and divine authority. He also had a specific practical problem. If the rescue ship arrived, there would not be enough space or supplies for everyone. Fewer survivors meant better odds for the ones who remained. He began organizing. Within weeks, Cornelisz had assembled a group of men loyal to him. He sent groups of survivors to other islands under the pretext of searching for water, stranding them in locations where he didn't have to manage them. He then began the killings. The methods were varied and deliberately pragmatic. Some victims were drowned, some were strangled, some were killed with improvised weapons. Women were kept alive as servants and for sexual use. Children and infants were killed systematically. Cornelisz's stated logic was consistent. He needed to reduce the number of survivors to a manageable size so that when Pelsaert returned with a ship, the survivors could seize it, acquire the silver from the wreck, and pursue a career of piracy. By the time the rescue arrived, he had murdered at least 125 people. The group that Cornelisz had sent to one of the outer islands, Wallabi Island, to perish found, unexpectedly, fresh water. Led by a soldier named Wiebbe Hayes, they survived and organized. Hayes's group learned about the murders when a survivor escaped and swam across to their island to warn them. Hayes organized a defensive force. Cornelisz's men mounted an attack on Wallabi Island to eliminate the witnesses. They were repulsed. They attacked again. They were repulsed again. In the meantime, Pelsaert returned on September 17, 1629, with the rescue ship Sardam. Hayes's men reached Pelsaert first, rowing out to intercept the ship before Cornelisz's men could. They told him everything. Cornelisz and his men, attempting to sail out and seize the Sardam, were confronted with the full account of what had occurred and surrounded. They surrendered. Francisco Pelsaert conducted a trial on the island. Cornelisz and the principal ringleaders confessed, some willingly, some under torture. They were convicted of murder. The sentences were carried out on the island itself, inside of the coral and the wreck. Cornelisz and 6 of his co-conspirators were hanged. As the leader, Cornelisz had both hands amputated before his execution. The others had one hand removed. The executions were conducted on the beach of the island where they had committed the murders. 2 others, young soldiers who had participated but whom Pelsaert judged potentially reformable, were marooned on the Australian mainland coast. They were left with enough supplies to survive in the short term. Whether they survived in the long term and what became of them is not known. They may have been the first Europeans to live for an extended period in Australia. The survivors who had not participated were taken aboard the Sardam. The cargo of silver was partially recovered from the wreck. The Batavia's sandstone reliefs, the decorative panels intended for the Governor-General's castle, were salvaged and are preserved today in the Western Australian Museum. 322 people boarded the Batavia in 1628. By the time rescue came, 125 of the survivors had been murdered by their fellow survivors. The man who organized the killings had done so on the specific logic that fewer survivors improved everyone's odds, a logic that was, in its own terms, coherent. The shipwreck where survivors murdered each other for 3 months. Not a story about what people do when they're desperate. A story about what a very specific kind of person does when all normal constraints are removed and no authority is watching. Cornelisz had both hands cut off before they hanged him. On the beach where he had ordered his men to kill women and children, with the wreck still visible in the water, it ended the way it should have ended. It started that way too. Subscribe if you want more. See you in the next one.